On March 31st, 1848, the dead began to speak. It wasn't a voice from the heavens, but a simple rapping in a lonely farmhouse, a code understood by two young sisters. From that knock, a new religion bloomed, a promise of communion for a world drowning in grief. It was called Spiritualism. But was it a true miracle, or just a clever story? The world's greatest magician, Harry Houdini, sought to find out. He asked for a message from his beloved mother, and a spirit answered. But this spirit made the sign of the cross, an impossible gesture for the devout rabbi's wife she had been in life. It called him Houdini, a name for the stage, not the name a mother gives her son. This single, flawed miracle ignited a war between two icons. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who created the world's greatest rationalist but chose to believe in magic, and Houdini, who created magic but chose to believe only in what he could prove. This is the story of a ghost craze that captivated millions, a story of faith, fraud, and our desperate hope that the grave is not the end. The only question is, was any of it real? To understand how the world came to believe it could speak with the dead, you have to understand the place where the dead first spoke back. This is upstate New York in the 1840s, a landscape of stark beauty and fierce winters. But it was known by another name, the Burned-Over District. It was a land scorched by the fires of religious revivalism. For decades, the Second Great Awakening had swept through these towns and villages, leaving behind a population convinced that the divine was not a distant, silent force. This was a crucible of faith, a place where direct personal communication with God, with angels, with spirits, was not just considered possible, but expected. It gave birth to apocalyptic prophets like the Millerites, who calculated the exact date of Christ's return. It spawned utopian experiments like the Shakers and the Oneida community, who sought to build heaven on earth. And it was here that Joseph Smith said, "An angel led him to the golden plates that became the Book of Mormon." This wasn't just a place of belief, it was a laboratory of new religions. This spiritual furnace was stoked by a grim, ever-present reality: death. In the mid-19th century, life was fragile. The average life expectancy was just over 40 years. In cities like New York, nearly half of all deaths were children under the age of 5. Death was not a sanitized, distant event that happened in hospitals. It happened in the home, in the next room, often in a mother's arms. This constant, intimate confrontation with loss created a profound cultural anxiety, a desperate hunger for proof that the grave was not the end, a hunger that traditional, often stern Calvinist doctrines of predestination could not always satisfy. Into this world of fervent faith and intimate grief stepped the Fox family. In December 1847, John and Margaret Fox, along with their 2 youngest daughters, moved into a small rented saltbox farmhouse in the hamlet of Hydesville, New York. John was a practical, hard-working Methodist farmer. His wife, Margaret, was more credulous, a woman who believed her own grandmother possessed a 6th sense and who was deeply superstitious. Their daughters were 15-year-old Margaretta, called Maggie, and 11-year-old Catherine, or Kate. The house itself already had a local reputation for being haunted, a fact not lost on the imaginative sisters. The night that changed everything was March 31st, 1848. It began with an unexplained rapping sound. The family was startled. At first, they searched for a rational cause, a loose shutter, a branch against the house, but found nothing. The sounds persisted, seeming to follow the girls from room to room. Then, a moment of inspiration, or perhaps desperation. Young Kate, in a display of childlike audacity, challenged the unseen presence. She snapped her fingers. A rap answered. She clapped her hands. A rap answered. Her mother, astonished, joined in. "Count 10, she said. 10 distinct knocks followed. "How old are my children?" The spirit rapped out the correct ages for all her children, living and dead. A channel had been opened. The family, with trembling hands, quickly devised a code. They would call out letters of the alphabet, and the spirit would rap when the correct one was reached, spelling out messages from beyond the grave. They gave their invisible correspondent a name, Mr. Splitfoot. Through this new spiritual telegraph, a story emerged. The spirit claimed to be a peddler named Charles B. Rosner, who had been murdered in the house years before, his body buried in the cellar. Though no record of a Charles Rosner was ever found, the story was electrifying. Word spread like wildfire. Neighbors like the Dooslers and Redfields crowded into the tiny farmhouse to witness the miracle. The story was picked up by the penny press, cheap newspapers that thrived on sensation. Soon the Fox sisters were a phenomenon. They were taken in by Amy and Isaac Post, prominent Quakers and abolitionists in Rochester, who were early and influential converts. But the figure who would truly transform this local curiosity into a global movement was the girl's older sister, Leah Fox Fish. A shrewd, ambitious, and worldly woman living in Rochester, Leah heard the news and immediately understood its profound significance. She took charge of her younger sisters, becoming their manager and protector. She organized their first public demonstration at the largest hall in Rochester, advertising it in the papers. The strange phenomenon that had manifested in a humble farmhouse was about to be presented to the world. Spiritualism, the religion, was born. The phenomenon that began in Hydesville exploded across America. By 1853, there were an estimated 30,000 mediums at work. By 1897, the movement claimed over 8 million followers. Why was a nation so proud of its practicality and progress, so ready to embrace ghosts? Part of the answer lies in spiritualism's brilliant self-branding. This was the age of invention, an era when new scientific discoveries were shaking the foundations of traditional faith. Fossils and geological records suggested the Earth was far older than the Bible claimed. Spiritualism offered a perfect compromise. It didn't ask for blind faith. It promised empirical proof. It called itself the scientific religion. The séance room was presented as a laboratory where phenomena could be observed under test conditions. The family's spiritual telegraph, as it came to be known, was a stroke of branding genius, reframing the supernatural as a new form of technology. This fusion of mysticism and science was irresistible. It allowed people to hold on to their belief in the soul's immortality while embracing the modern world's demand for evidence. But the single greatest catalyst for spiritualism's growth was an unprecedented tide of national grief. The American Civil War carved a wound across the country, taking more than 620,000 lives. The war did more than just kill. It destroyed the Victorian ideal of the good death. For centuries, a good death meant dying at home, surrounded by family, with time for last words and proper goodbyes. The war replaced this with anonymous, brutal deaths on distant battlefields, leaving hundreds of thousands of families with no body, no grave, and no closure. Into this vast, echoing silence, spiritualism offered a voice. It promised that loved ones were not gone, merely in a higher sphere, and that a connection was still possible. Grieving mothers, fathers, wives, and children flocked to mediums, desperate for one last message of peace. The number of believers swelled dramatically. By the end of the war, some contemporaries estimated that as many as 11 million Americans subscribed to spiritualist beliefs. The ultimate symbol of this national mourning took place in the nation's most famous home. First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln was a woman intimately acquainted with grief, having lost her mother and 2 young sons. The death of her beloved 11-year-old son, Willie, from typhoid fever in the White House in 1862, shattered her. In her despair, she turned to spiritualism. She began consulting with well-known mediums in nearby Georgetown, a group led by a family named Laurie. Soon she was holding her own séances in the Red Room of the White House, hoping to contact her dead sons. She was convinced she succeeded. She told her half-sister that Willie visited her every night at the foot of her bed, sometimes bringing his brother Eddie with him. President Abraham Lincoln, a man of deep but unconventional faith, sometimes attended these séances. Most scholars believe he did so not out of belief, but out of a tender concern for his grieving wife and a quiet, skeptical curiosity. His presence, however reluctant, showed just how far spiritualism had reached, from a humble farmhouse to the very heart of a nation at war with itself. But spiritualism offered more than just comfort for personal grief. It became a revolutionary force for social change. In an era when most established churches reinforced the existing social order, spiritualism was radically progressive. Its most radical tenet was its view of women. Spiritualism was one of the only religious movements of its time that treated women as equals. At a time when women were forbidden from speaking in public, let alone from the pulpit of a church, mediumship provided an extraordinary loophole. A woman in a trance, speaking not with her own voice, but with the voice of a spirit, could command the attention of thousands. This unique authority, derived from direct contact with the divine, gave women a public platform they had never known. And they used that platform. The spiritualist movement became deeply intertwined with the most radical reform movements of the day, abolitionism and women's suffrage. All spiritualists advocated for women's rights, and many were fervent abolitionists, seeing slavery as a profound sin that must be eradicated. The ranks of spiritualism were filled with reformers. Famous medium Victoria Woodhull leveraged her spiritual authority to become the first woman to run for President of the United States in 1872. Her radical views on suffrage and free love earned her the moniker Mrs. Satan from a threatened establishment. The legendary abolitionist and women's rights advocate Sojourner Truth was also a spiritualist, finding in the movement a spiritual framework for her fight for equality. Abolitionists like Amy and Isaac Post, the Fox sisters' first patrons, and Pascal Beverly Randolph, a trance medium of mixed race, saw spiritualism and abolition as 2 sides of the same coin. A fight for the freedom of the human spirit, both in this life and the next. For these reformers, spiritualism was not an escape from the world's problems. It was a weapon to fight them. The voices from the beyond didn't just offer solace. They demanded justice for the living. The movement's power came from this unique fusion. It gave a voice back to the dead for the grieving, and for the first time, it gave a powerful public voice to the living who had been silenced by society. But America was not the only country haunted by this new faith. The ghost craze went global, and in other cultures, it evolved into something far different. While Americans were asking spirits to tip their tables, a French intellectual was asking them about the very nature of reality. His name was Hippolyte Rivail, but the spirits told him that in a previous life, he had been a druid priest named Allan Kardec. Under that name, he would become the lawgiver of the spirit world. Kardec didn't rely on one medium. He compiled answers to over 1,000 philosophical questions from dozens of different mediumistic groups across Paris, looking for consensus. The result was the Spirit's Book, the foundational text of a new movement, Spiritism. Unlike American spiritualism, which focused on reunion in a vague summerland, Kardec's spirits offered a detailed cosmic map. Life on Earth was not a one-time event, but a school. We are immortal spirits, evolving through countless reincarnations on this world and others to shed our imperfections. Karma was not a mystery, it was cosmic justice. While the rapping eventually faded in America, Kardec's philosophy exploded in Latin America, particularly Brazil. Here, Spiritism wasn't just a parlor game, it became a powerful force for social good, establishing hospitals, charities, and publishing houses that operate to this day, treating physical and spiritual maladies side by side. For millions, Allan Kardec's name holds more weight than the Fox sisters ever did. The Séance room was the sacred theatre of spiritualism, a laboratory where the veil between worlds grew thin. Here, under the watchful eyes of believers, the spirits didn't just speak, they performed. An entire culture of contact emerged, a grammar of the ghostly, where mediums like living conduits manifested an astonishing array of supernatural proofs. It began with the séance itself. Friends and family would gather, often around a heavy wooden table in a darkened parlor. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and reverence. They would hold hands, forming a circuit of belief, their combined energy thought to provide the power the spirits needed to manifest. The medium, the focal point of this circuit, would enter a trance, their body becoming a vessel for the departed. From this charged silence, the phenomena would bloom. Table tipping was often the first sign of contact. A massive mahogany table would shudder, then begin to tilt, knocking out messages with its legs. 1 knock for no, 2 for maybe, 3 for yes. Sometimes it would levitate entirely, hovering inches or even feet off the floor with no visible means of support, held aloft, believers claimed, by sheer spiritual force. Then came the sounds. A disembodied whisper might issue from a floating spirit trumpet, a long metal cone that seemed to dance in the air, amplifying the voices of the dead. Guitars would strum themselves, and bells would ring inside sealed boxes, all played by unseen hands. For more direct communication, there was automatic writing. A medium's hand, holding a pencil, would begin to move with a will of its own, scratching out pages of dense script, purportedly dictated by a spirit control. A more theatrical version used a planchette, a small heart-shaped wooden board on wheels with a pencil attached. As sitters rested their fingertips lightly upon it, the planchette would skate across a sheet of paper, scrawling messages from another world, a direct ancestor of the modern Ouija board. But the most breathtaking and bizarre proof was physical. The medium might produce ectoplasm, a strange, luminous, gauze-like substance that would issue from their mouth, nose, or ears. It was considered the very stuff of spirits, a protoplasmic building material that could be molded by the dead into temporary hands, faces, or even full-body apparitions that would walk among the sitters before dissolving back into the medium's body. Perhaps the most cherished proof was spirit photography. A person mourning a lost child or husband could sit for a portrait, and when the plate was developed, a ghostly, transparent face would appear beside them, the image of their departed loved one returned for one final picture. Photographers like William H. Mumler produced thousands of these images, providing grieving families with tangible, heartbreaking proof that their loved ones were still watching over them. Each photograph was a holy relic, a miraculous fusion of the era's most advanced technology and its deepest spiritual yearning. This was not just about tricks in the dark. It was a shared, visceral experience that answered a profound human need. For millions, these phenomena were not just real. They were a new gospel, written not in ancient scripture, but in levitating tables, ghostly photographs, and the ectoplasmic residue of the returning dead. And where there was a gospel, an industry soon followed to sell salvation. As spiritualism swelled from a parlor phenomenon into a national movement, a vast and complex industry bloomed in the darkness behind it. This was the Gilded Age, an era of invention, industry, and mass marketing. And in the same way that Sears and Roebuck could deliver a prefabricated house to your door, a new network of entrepreneurs arose to package, professionalize, and sell access to the hereafter. It began with a practical question for the thousands of new working mediums. How do you make the spirits perform on cue, night after night? The answer arrived in a plain brown wrapper. It came in the form of mail-order catalogs, secretly circulated from suppliers in Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York. These were the blueprints for a haunting, an arsenal of apparitions for the professional showman. Thumbing through the pages of a catalogue from a company like Ralph E. Sylvester or the Davenport Brothers was like perusing a tradesman's guide to the supernatural. For a few dollars, a medium could purchase the hardware of the hereafter. There were collapsible, spring-loaded spirit hands that could be concealed in a pocket and made to appear in the dim light. There were bottles of luminous paint mixed with phosphorus to create ghostly glows on trumpets or to paint eerie faces on cheesecloth. There were trick slates with hidden inner compartments for producing spirit writing, and self-playing accordions fitted with silent pneumatic bulbs that could be squeezed by the medium's foot. For the more ambitious, there were full-body ghost costumes made of the finest, lightest gauze, and complex harnesses for producing full-table levitations, guaranteed to astound the clientele. This wasn't framed as deception. It was sold under the guise of physical phenomena apparatus and aids for the modern medium, professionalizing the craft and ensuring a consistent, repeatable miracle. For $5, you could buy a voice from the beyond. For $10, you could make the furniture dance. But an army of mediums needs more than just equipment. It needs a way to communicate. The central nervous system of the movement was printed on news stock in Boston. Newspapers like the Banner of Light were the sacred text and social network of spiritualism, connecting believers from isolated farm towns to the bustling brownstones of the city. A subscription to the Banner was a subscription to the faith itself. Its pages published the travel schedules for popular touring mediums, letting followers know when a trance lecturer or slate writer would be visiting their town. It offered transcripts from seances with the spirits of the great and the good. A subscriber could read Ben Franklin's thoughts on the politics of the Summerland, or receive messages of hope from a recently departed child. Most famously, the Banner featured a message department, a kind of spiritual advice column. Readers from across the country would mail in the names of their deceased loved ones, and the paper's in-house trance mediums would channel a reply, printing it in the next issue for all to see. It became a public forum for private grief, a weekly dose of reassurance that the lines of communication were open. The paper was also where the community policed itself, running heated debates on the nature of ectoplasm or printing scathing accusations against mediums suspected of fraud. And around these articles, advertisements bloomed. Clairvoyant physicians diagnosing illnesses from afar, spirit-guided business consultants offering tips from the spectral plane, and magnetoelectric healing devices promising to cure earthly ailments with invisible forces. The Banner of Light wasn't just reporting on a religion, it was actively building one week by week. With a shared press and a common set of practices, the final step was to claim physical territory. For the most devout believers, a weekend séance wasn't enough. They needed a permanent Zion, a place insulated from the cynical, unbelieving world. And so, communities began to spring up, part religious retreat, part Chautauqua, part summer camp for psychics. The most famous was Lily Dale, founded in 1879 on the shore of a placid lake in upstate New York. To own property in Lily Dale, one had to be a registered member of the Spiritualist Association. It was a gated community for the gifted. The town became a living laboratory for the faith. A visitor could wander down streets lined with Victorian gingerbread houses, each with a shingle out front advertising the resident medium's specialty, from trance healing to spirit photography. You could attend a service in the healing temple or make your way to the edge of the woods to Inspiration Stump. a massive petrified tree stump where several times a day mediums would stand to deliver messages from the spirit world to the gathered crowds. Even the pets had a place in the hereafter, with a dedicated pet cemetery to honor their enduring souls. Lilydale was a place where the veil was permanently thin, a town where conversations with the dead were as common as conversations about the weather, and it endures. It stands today as a living museum of the great ghost craze, a testament to the fact that spiritualism was more than a belief. It was a world unto itself, complete with its own economy, its own media, and its own sacred ground. By the early 20th century, spiritualism needed a champion. It had grown from a grassroots phenomenon into an established faith, but it was constantly under assault from skeptics and accusations of fraud. It found its greatest defender in the most unlikely of men, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who gave the world its ultimate icon of cold, deductive logic. Sherlock Holmes, a character who famously declared, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." Yet, the man who wrote those words would devote the last years of his life to championing what most of the world considered impossible. How could the father of rationalism become the world's most ardent believer in ghosts? The common story is that Conan Doyle's belief was a sudden, desperate reaction to the death of his son in World War I. The truth is far more complex. His journey into spiritualism was not a sprint, but a slow, methodical, 30-year walk from curiosity to conviction. As early as 1887, long before the war, he published a letter in a spiritualist journal, declaring psychical research a subject he had thought more and been slower to form my opinion about than upon any other subject whatever. In 1893, he joined the prestigious Society for Psychical Research, an organization founded by leading academics and scientists to investigate paranormal claims. Its members included a future prime minister and some of the most respected scientific minds of the age. For years, he was a self-professed novice and inquirer, experimenting with table tipping, automatic writing, and mesmerism. He was not a blind believer. He was a man conducting an investigation. He was deeply impressed that brilliant scientists, men like chemist William Crookes and Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution, were convinced of survival after death. If these giants of science could believe, he reasoned, then the subject could not be dismissed as a vulgar delusion. It was the Great War that transformed Conan Doyle's private intellectual pursuit into a passionate public crusade. The sheer scale of the slaughter was apocalyptic. Like countless others, Doyle's family was devastated. He lost his son Kingsley, his brother, 2 brothers-in-law, and 2 nephews. In the depths of his grief, he attended a séance where he believed he made contact with his departed son. The comfort he received was so profound, so absolute, that it became what he called a vital message for a world drowning in sorrow. He felt it was his solemn duty to share this proof of survival. He threw his immense fame, his fortune, and his energy into the cause, becoming, as one contemporary called him, the St. Paul of spiritualism. He toured the world, giving lectures, writing books, and defending the faith against all critics, willing to sacrifice his literary reputation for what he now considered the most important thing in the world. To his critics, Conan Doyle was a great mind lost to grief, a gullible giant. His infamous championing of the Cottingley fairies, a series of faked photographs of young girls with cardboard cutout fairies, is often held up as proof. But to see this as simple foolishness is to miss the point. Conan Doyle's belief was not a rejection of the modern world, but an attempt to heal it. He saw a world that had become soulless and mechanistic, a world whose cold logic had led to the industrial slaughter of millions in the trenches. He believed spiritualism was a new science, one that could prove the human spirit was more than just a machine. He wanted, desperately, for the world to be enchanted again, for it to hold more wonder and less pain. He wasn't just looking for ghosts, he was looking for hope. And in the blurry image of a paper fairy, he thought he had found it. His motives, as he saw them, were pure, even if his methods were not those of his most famous creation. As Sir Arthur Conan Doyle became spiritualism's greatest champion, his greatest challenger was preparing to take the stage: Harry Houdini, the man whose very name was synonymous with mystery. The world's greatest escape artist, a mysterious entertainer who could free himself from any earthly restraint. Houdini's crusade against fraudulent mediums was driven by two powerful, deeply personal forces. The first was grief. He adored his mother Cecilia, and her death in 1913 left a wound that never healed. In his book, A Magician Among the Spirits, he confessed he would have parted gladly with a large share of my earthly possessions for the solace of one word from my loved departed. He genuinely searched for a real medium, making pacts with friends that whoever died first would try to make contact. No one ever did. The second force was professional pride. Houdini was a master illusionist who respected his craft. He was infuriated by the charlatans of the séance room, whom he saw as an unethical branch of his profession. They used cheap, clumsy tricks in the dark, preying on the vulnerable and insulting the artistry of true performers. He had once been a medium himself in his youth, and he knew all the secrets. As he famously said, "It takes a flim-flammer to catch a flim-flammer." His crusade soon brought him into conflict, not just with believers, but with the law, or rather, the lack of it. How does one prosecute a ghost? In Britain, the authorities reached for an ancient law, the Witchcraft Act of 1735. Mediums weren't charged with consorting with the devil, but with the more modern crime of pretending to conjure spirits for money. The law had been designed to stop witch hunts, but it was now the perfect weapon to hunt fraudulent psychics. The most famous case was that of Dr. Henry Slade, an American medium renowned for his slate-writing phenomena. When two investigators snatched his slate mid-séance and found the spirit message already written, it sparked an international legal battle that became a public spectacle, pitting leading scientists who believed in Slade against the magicians who knew his tricks. In 1920, the great believer and the great skeptic met, sparking one of the strangest friendships of the century. Conan Doyle and Houdini were both global celebrities, larger-than-life figures, who shared a powerful charisma and boundless energy. Doyle, the sportsman and adventurer, was impressed by Houdini's physical prowess. Houdini, who craved intellectual respectability, was flattered by the friendship of the world-famous author. For several years, they maintained a warm correspondence, their opposing views on spiritualism a point of friendly debate. Conan Doyle was convinced Houdini's escapes were themselves supernatural feats, a sign of his immense mediumistic power. Houdini, not wanting to offend his friend, largely hid the true depth of his skepticism. The friendship shattered after that fateful séance in Atlantic City in 1922, when Lady Doyle channeled the flawed message from Houdini's mother. What began as private, pointed letters soon erupted into a public war of words in the pages of the New York Times. Conan Doyle accused Houdini of being a biased investigator, blinded by his own ego. Houdini retorted that there was nothing that Sir Arthur will believe that surprises me. The two men, once friends, were now bitter public rivals, their tours clashing across America as each tried to win the public to his side. The break with Doyle galvanized Houdini. He launched an all-out public crusade against spiritualism. He joined a committee organized by the magazine Scientific American, which offered a $2,500 prize to any medium who could prove their abilities under scientific test conditions. Houdini's role was to be the expert witness, the guarantor that no trickery was involved. His most famous target was a Boston medium named Mina Crandon, who went by the name Marjorie. She was the most convincing contender for the prize, producing floating trumpets, ringing bells and whispers from her spirit guide, Walter. Houdini was unimpressed. He designed a fraud-proof spirit cabinet to restrain her, and before the committee even finished its investigation, he preemptively published a pamphlet exposing her tricks, effectively killing her chances at the prize. The crusade reached its zenith in 1926. Houdini traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify before a congressional committee, lobbying for a bill that would outlaw fortune-telling for hire in the Capitol. It was the performance of a lifetime. He turned the hearing room into a stage, demonstrating for the congressman how easily spirit slates could be faked and spirit trumpets made to whisper in their ears. He declared plainly, "This thing they call spiritualism, wherein a medium intercommunicates with the dead, is a fraud from start to finish." And for Houdini, fraud wasn't just a matter of cheap tricks. He was fighting a darkness that preyed on the vulnerable. The spirits often had advice on earthly matters, especially love. They spoke of spiritual affinities, soulmates destined to be together, regardless of earthly marriages. For some, this was a liberating doctrine of free love. But in the hands of less scrupulous mediums, it became a justification for adultery and the breaking of families. The darkened séance room offered a unique opportunity for predators. Male mediums were frequently accused of taking advantage of female sitters, claiming their actions were controlled by an impetuous spirit, or that a carnal act was necessary to renew their psychic energy. These weren't just whispers. They erupted into public scandals and lawsuits, revealing a disturbing pattern of abuse hidden behind the veil. This was the world Houdini sought to destroy. It was his final great act. Just a few months later, on Halloween 1926, Harry Houdini died from a ruptured appendix. The world's greatest escape artist had made his final exit, leaving his war against the spirits unfinished. While Houdini battled the spirits with logic and stagecraft, the real secret of the séance room was far simpler and far more cynical. The secrets to these miracles were the very items sold in the mail-order catalogues Houdini knew so well. So-called ectoplasm was often just fine muslin, cheesecloth, or even a mixture of soap, gelatin, and egg white, swallowed by the medium before the séance and regurgitated in the dim light. Spirit photography relied on simple darkroom fraud, like double exposures, or using pre-prepared photographic plates. Table turning and levitation were accomplished with hidden hooks, wires, or the medium simply using their own feet and knees under the cover of darkness. This wasn't just deception, it was theft, stealing hope from the grieving for profit. And the original miracle, the spark that lit the flame, the wrapping in the Hydesville farmhouse. 40 years after that fateful night, the truth finally came out from the women who started it all. The fame that Maggie and Kate Fox had found as children became a lifelong prison. Pressured into a career they never chose, they were financially exploited and controlled by their older sister Leah. The constant performance, the public scrutiny, and the internal weight of their secret led both sisters into severe alcoholism. Their lives became a heartbreaking saga of poverty, failed romances, and increasingly unreliable seances. Maggie fell in love with an Arctic explorer, Elisha Kent Kane, who died tragically, leaving her broken-hearted. Kate's drinking became so severe that other spiritualists accused her of being an unfit mother. In 1888, 40 years after the first raps were heard in Hydesville, a lifetime of resentment, grief, and desperation finally boiled over. Maggie Fox, now a weary, middle-aged woman, decided to tell the truth. Driven by a burning rage at her sister Leah, who had grown wealthy and respectable while shunning her, and offered $1,500 by the New York World newspaper for an exclusive, Maggie booked the New York Academy of Music to make a public confession. She told the audience that spiritualism was a fraud of the worst description, a miserable deception that she could no longer bear. Then, she prepared for the demonstration. An eyewitness described the scene. Maggie sat on a plain wooden chair. She removed her shoes and stockings. She invited doctors from the audience to come on stage and examine her to ensure no trickery was involved. They found nothing. She placed her bare foot upon a small wooden stool. A hush fell over the packed hall. Rap. And then another. And another. The sound was clear, loud, and inexplicable. She had done it. She had revealed the simple, secret engine of a global religion. She was cracking the joints in her toes and ankles. It began, she explained, as a simple prank to frighten their mother. In a box overlooking the stage, her sister Kate sat in silence, lending her tacit support to the confession. The confession was a bombshell. Skeptics and newspapers crowed, "I told you so!" It should have been the death blow to spiritualism, but it wasn't. The movement by then was 40 years old. It had millions of followers, its own churches, periodicals, and leaders. The power of spiritualism wasn't just in the tricks, it was in the minds of the audience. Psychologists today have a term for it: cognitive dissonance. When a deeply held belief that provides immense comfort is challenged by facts, it's often easier for the human mind to reject the facts than to abandon the belief. For a mother who had spoken to her lost son, Maggie Fox's confession wasn't proof of a hoax. It was a tragedy about a disturbed woman. The experience of the séance was simply more real to her than the exposé in the newspaper. For devout believers, their own personal experiences in the séance room, the comfort they'd received, the messages they'd heard, were more real than the confession of a woman they now dismissed as a sad, tired drunk, likely bribed by skeptics. Spiritualism had grown far beyond its founders. It no longer needed the Fox sisters or their truth. While the movement survived, its founders did not. The confession ruined what was left of their careers. A year later, destitute, Maggie recanted her statement and tried to return to mediumship, but the magic was gone. Their reputation was destroyed. Kate Fox, estranged from her children, died from complications of alcoholism in 1892. Less than a year later, in March 1893, Maggie Fox died alone and penniless in a friend's tenement apartment in Brooklyn. The two young girls who had started a worldwide religious movement with a prank in a farmhouse died in abject poverty, consumed and ultimately discarded by their own creation. So what became of the great fire of belief that the Fox sisters ignited? Spiritualism as a formal religion began to wane after the 1920s. The death of its great champion, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, in 1930, and the relentless campaign of its great skeptic Harry Houdini had taken their toll. The world was changing. But the ghost of spiritualism never truly left. It simply changed its form, its echoes lingering in the static of our own culture. The legacy of spiritualism is all around us, often in ways we don't recognize. The alphabet dials and automatic writing planchettes used in early seances evolved directly into a 20th century pop culture icon, the Ouija board, which democratized spirit communication and brought the seance from the medium's parlor into every teenager's bedroom. The scientific impulse of the movement, embodied by the Society for Psychical Research, didn't die out. It laid the groundwork for the formal academic study of parapsychology at institutions like Duke University, continuing the quest to find scientific proof for phenomena like telepathy and clairvoyance. And the broader themes of spiritualism, channeling, reincarnation, communicating with spirit guides, became foundational tenets of the New Age movement and have woven themselves into the fabric of popular culture. Every paranormal reality TV show, every celebrity psychic, every ghost hunting tour is a direct descendant of the spectacle and curiosity that the Fox sisters first unleashed. Spiritualism created a cultural template for how we engage with the paranormal. It established the key players, the celebrity medium, the scientific investigator, and the central conflict between personal experience and objective proof that defines the conversation to this day. And yet, even with the confessions and the exposés, a few stubborn mysteries refuse to be neatly filed away. The story of spiritualism is littered with charlatans, but it also contains figures like Daniel Douglas Home, a medium who reportedly levitated his own body in front of credible witnesses and was never caught in fraud. These anomalies don't prove the existence of ghosts, but they remind us that the movement's power lay in its ability to operate in the grey spaces between what is known and what is merely possible. They are the footnotes in the story that keep the question mark alive. But its most enduring legacy is the question it tried to answer. The movement rose from a universal human need, the desperate longing to pierce the veil of death, to find meaning in devastating loss, and to believe, against all evidence or because of it, that love and consciousness are not extinguished by the grave.